up until last year, I used to teach quite a bit of kind of creativity training, if you like. I used to do quite a few sessions on creativity for undergraduate students. And one of the, not just undergraduates, actually postgrads as well, but one of the themes that used to run through a lot of that, one of the kind of aphorisms that I used to use as a hanger, some of the things we used to talk about, was this phrase, produce with abandon, select with care. Produce with abandon, select with care. And I still think of it sometimes, and I still use it with some students that I work with now, and I still use it occasionally myself. And what that's kind of about really is a kind of recognition to, well, two phases in creative processes, but correlations between those phases in creative processes, with differences in the kind of the psychology of creativity, the sociology of creativity, the politics of creativity. All those kind of distinctions can be, I think, quite usefully correlated with that kind of primary and easily remembered phrase, produce with abandon, select with care. Because when you're working individually and you're working creatively, there's a certain phase quite early on in the process when what you need to do is produce, and it's all about production. And that has to, I think, be accompanied by very particular kinds of mental states and very particular kinds of activities. You can produce best, I think, when, well, certainly when you're in a positive frame of mind. Ideally when you're exuberant. I think when there's an exuberance in you, it's much easier to produce. You come out with creative responses, imaginative responses, novel responses. And not just responses, proactively produce novel and imaginative ideas spontaneously when you are exuberant, when you are kind of overflowing. I think partly related to that, and probably also related to the idea of being exuberantly productive, is to do with security. You have to feel kind of safe and supported, and none of your basic needs have to be making impositions on you at that moment. It's very, very difficult to be productive in this kind of way that I'm speaking about right now, this kind of incontinent production, when you have a deadline, for example, because that's a very particular demand that's being made on your resources, or when you're in one of that kind of halt things, the hungry, angry, lonely, tired situation. If you're hungry, if you're angry, if you're lonely, or you're tired, again, these are quite specific needs which impinge upon your sense of integrity, your sense of security, your sense of openness, and prevent you being productive. They quell your exuberance. They channel your exuberance, what would normally be exuberance, into toward very specific ends, the meeting of one of those needs. And so, if you like, there's nothing left to flow over into this exuberance. So again, there's a kind of mental state and a kind of physical conditions, if you like, which support that state by not making those hungry, angry, lonely, tired demands upon you, and those deadline requirements of you. And the same is also true, I think, when you're working in a group, because group creativity has a lot of correlates with individual creativity. But when you're working in a group, the same kind of things apply. There has to be, you can't really think of it in terms of group mind, but there has to be a kind of group support for a certain kind of psychology. The group effectively has to keep saying yes at this phase. If there's someone in the group who is saying no, that effectively acts as a channel for the exuberance to flow off into, and it acts like a restriction. So, in order to produce with abandon, as a collective, as a collaborative group, you also have to have a kind of the social psychology of that group also has to be supportive in the same way that the individual psychology has to be supportive if you're producing and creating individually. And again, the same kind of things apply to do with security, to do with being hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, to do with trust. All those kind of things kick in as well when you're working collaboratively or working in a group. So in terms of the first part of that aphorism, produce with abandon, select with care, that the ability to produce with abandon is contingent upon very particular social, psychological, institutional perhaps, temporal conditions, and getting those conditions right is really, really important. The second part, the select with care, or as I sometimes say, edit with care, is a completely different process, and I think tangling up causes all sorts of problems. Selecting with care on an individual level doesn't demand exuberance at all. It doesn't demand any kind of overflowing. It demands a harnessing, a channeling, a focusing. It requires those kind of metaphors to be employed, so that the results of that exuberant activity can be evaluated properly. It requires a certain kind of critical thinking, which is an outcome of that focusing, an outcome of that channeling, so that you can compare one thing to another thing and apply specific value judgments related to the project that you're going on, or just be able to read off specific values. You don't even necessarily have to go in with value judgments. You just have to be critically sensitive to the value judgments that the work you're engaged in seems to be offering. I should add, by the way, at this point, I'm not specifically talking about creativity in the arts. It could be creativity in any kind of field of activity. So when you're working individually, those are the kind of critical skills, the kind of mental state you need to be in. It's much less alpha and much more beta, and much more in that kind of EEG reading. But it's also much more focused. It's much more singular and purposive and rational, if you like. It sounds cold-blooded, but from personal experience, I would say it doesn't feel like that. It feels, how does it feel? Well, it can feel a little bit like walking on a frosty morning. It can have that kind of sharpness to it if you get it right. And the same thing applies collectively. So if you're producing collectively and being creative collectively, again, particular kind of social skills have to kick in, particular kind of social rules of operation, rules of engagement, to allow criticism to happen in a way which is supportive, non-destructive, which is sensitive to the values that are emerging from the work, is sensitive to opportunities as they emerge, which doesn't let other kinds of agendas come into the room to do with interpersonal relationships, those kind of things. So again, a completely different set of skills, completely different mindset, completely different actions and outcomes as emerging from that. So why am I talking about that? I suppose, I started thinking about this because I've just finished reading Clay Shirky's book, Here Comes Everybody, and one of the chapters in there is to do with the how, well, particularly Web 2.0 technology, but the web more generally, has changed the frame in which creativity tends to take place. He says that up until relatively recently, the standard process for publishing, particularly, but he's talking about creativity generally, would be that you would make something, you would edit it, and then you would publish it. So it'd be edit, then publish, or in the terms of, edit and publish. So to put that into the aphorism that I started with, produce with abandon, select with care, you would say the old model was produce with abandon, select with care, and then publish. But he says that point of publication has changed. Now what you do is you publish first, effectively kind of crowdsource your activity, and then begin to publish after that, once kind of feedback processes, crowdsourcing processes have enacted their magic on your work, if you like. So now it's produce with abandon, publish, select with care, and maybe publish again, but it becomes much more cyclical at that point. So the point of publication is shifted back.